Please don't make her leave like Mommy. The little girl's trembling voice shattered the silence of the marble hallway just as billionaire Alexander Hayes turned toward the front door of his Manhattan penthouse. Snow pressed softly against the 30-foot windows behind him, turning the city outside into a blur of white lights and shadows. But inside the mansion, the air felt colder than the storm itself. Emily Carter stood frozen near the staircase in her plain gray Maid uniform, her fingers tightening around the strap of her cleaning bag, while two security guards waited for Alexander's command. Sophie Hayes clung desperately to Emily's waist, her tiny hands shaking. "Daddy, please," she whispered again, tears rolling down her pale cheeks. "Don't send her away." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had spent years building one of the most powerful tech companies in America, negotiating billion-dollar deals without emotion, without hesitation, but somehow the sight of his 7-year-old daughter crying in the middle of the night made him feel completely unprepared. His cold blue eyes shifted toward Emily. "Why were you in my private office?" he asked quietly. Emily swallowed hard. The grandfather clock near the fireplace ticked loudly in the silence. She could still feel her pulse racing from the moment he caught her standing beside his desk only minutes earlier. "I was cleaning," she answered softly. Alexander took one slow step forward. "At midnight." His voice never rose, but somehow that made it worse. The penthouse lights reflected against the polished black floor beneath his expensive shoes, while Emily suddenly became painfully aware of her thrift store sneakers and the loose thread hanging from the sleeve of her uniform. She looked like she didn't belong in this world. Maybe she never had. Sophie hugged Emily tighter. "She stayed because I had a nightmare," the little girl said through tears. "She read me stories until I fell asleep." Alexander's expression flickered for just a second before hardening again. Ever since his wife Claire died 18 months ago, Sophie barely spoke to anyone. Not the therapists, not the private tutors, not the expensive nannies, who lasted less than a week before quitting under the crushing silence of the Hayes mansion. But somehow this quiet young maid from Brooklyn had managed to do what nobody else could. She made Sophie smile again. Emily carefully knelt beside the little girl and brushed a strand of blonde hair from her face. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered gently. "Your dad's just trying to protect you." Alexander watched the moment in silence. Something about the way Sophie instinctively leaned into Emily's touch made his chest tighten unexpectedly. It reminded him too much of Claire. Warm kitchen mornings, soft laughter, the sound of pancakes sizzling while snow fell outside their old townhouse before money changed everything. Before grief turned this home into something that felt more like a museum than a family. Emily slowly stood again, keeping her eyes lowered. "I should leave," she murmured. Sophie immediately panicked. "No," she cried, clutching Emily's hand. "You promised you'd stay until my birthday." Emily's heart cracked a little at the desperation in the child's voice. Because the truth was, she never planned to care this much. When Emily first applied for the maid position at Hayes Manor 3 months earlier, she came with a completely different purpose. Revenge. Her late father had once worked for Hayes Technologies before losing everything after a scandal destroyed his career. He died believing Alexander Hayes ruined his life. And Emily came into this mansion intending to find proof. But she never expected the billionaire behind the headlines to look so exhausted every night. She never expected the little girl with sad gray eyes to wait by the window every evening, hoping her father would come home before bedtime. And she definitely never expected herself to start falling in love with the broken family she came here to hate. Alexander suddenly noticed something crumpled in Sophie's small hand. "What's that?" he asked quietly. Sophie hesitated before holding up a folded drawing made with crayons. "It's my family picture," she whispered. Alexander carefully took the paper from her trembling fingers. His breath caught instantly. 3 stick figures stood under a yellow sun. 1 tall man, 1 little girl, and beside them, a woman with long brown hair. Emily. At the top, written in uneven childish letters, were 4 words that made the entire room fall silent. "Please don't leave again." Alexander stared at the childish drawing in his hands long after Sophie stopped crying. The crayon sun in the corner was uneven, the blue house crooked, but what unsettled him was the woman standing beside them in the picture. Emily. Not Claire. Not the memory Sophie refused to let go of for the past year and a half. Emily. His daughter had drawn her into the empty space their family had carried since the funeral. The realization hit harder than he expected. Sophie wiped her wet cheeks with the sleeve of her pajamas and looked up at him carefully, almost fearfully, like she was waiting for him to break something fragile. "Daddy," she whispered. Alexander slowly lowered the paper. The fireplace crackled softly behind him while snow continued drifting against the glass walls overlooking Central Park. For a moment, nobody moved. Then he looked toward the security guards near the elevator. "Leave us." The men immediately nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Emily let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Sophie still refused to release her hand. Alexander rubbed his jaw tiredly before glancing at the clock near the staircase. 2:43 in the morning. Another sleepless night. Another meeting canceled because he could not focus long enough to pretend his life was under control. "Take Sophie upstairs," he finally said quietly. Emily hesitated. "Sir, I can explain about your office." "Tomorrow," he interrupted without looking at her. "Not tonight." His voice sounded exhausted more than angry now. Sophie immediately brightened. "So she is staying?" Alexander looked at his daughter. The hope in her little face made something twist painfully in his chest. "Tonight," he answered carefully. Sophie smiled for the first time all evening and pulled Emily toward the stairs. Halfway up, Emily glanced back. Alexander still stood alone near the fireplace holding the drawing in silence, his expensive black sweater wrinkled from exhaustion, one hand in his pocket while the other tightly gripped the crumpled paper. For the first time since Emily entered this mansion, he did not look like a billionaire. He looked like a man drowning quietly where nobody could see him. Upstairs, Sophie climbed into bed while Emily tucked the blanket around her small shoulders. The bedroom glowed softly beneath warm amber lights. Stuffed animals lined perfectly across the shelves beside framed photographs of Claire Hayes smiling on beaches, at birthday parties, wrapped in winter scarves beside Alexander before grief hollowed the family apart. Sophie hugged her rabbit plush tighter. "Daddy liked you before tonight," she whispered sleepily. Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" "He watches you when you make pancakes." Emily almost laughed quietly. "That does not sound very romantic." Sophie frowned seriously. "What is romantic?" Emily gently brushed hair from the little girl's forehead. "Something adults overcomplicate." Sophie yawned. "Mommy used to say Daddy forgot how to smile before he met her." The words settled heavily between them. Emily dimmed the bedside lamp slightly. "Get some sleep, sweetheart." But Sophie reached for her wrist before she could leave. "You are not going to disappear too, right?" Emily froze. The fear in the child's eyes was too real for someone so young. Slowly, Emily sat beside her. "No," she whispered softly. "I am right here." Downstairs, Alexander walked silently into his private office. The room smelled faintly of leather, cedarwood, and old books. His laptop still glowed on the desk beside stacks of financial reports nobody had touched all week. But his attention drifted immediately toward the small silver key missing from the bottom drawer. The drawer Emily had opened earlier. Slowly, he unlocked it himself and stared inside. Old documents. Confidential company files. Newspaper clippings from nearly 10 years ago. One article sat folded at the top. Local engineer fired after corporate data leak scandal. Beneath the headline was a familiar last name. Carter. Alexander's expression darkened slightly as memories surfaced. A quiet employee. Honest reputation. Sudden disappearance. After the investigation, he had barely thought about the case in years. But now Emily Carter was standing inside his home pretending to be only a maid. And somehow his daughter already loved her. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair while the city lights flickered beyond the snowstorm outside. Then he noticed something tucked inside the folder that had never been there before. A handwritten note in delicate cursive. "If you are reading this, then I finally found the truth about my father." Emily woke before sunrise to the sound of soft piano music drifting through the mansion. For a moment she forgot where she was. The guest-made room was still dark except for faint blue morning lights slipping through the curtains, and somewhere downstairs someone was playing a slow, haunting melody that made the enormous penthouse feel strangely human again. She sat up carefully, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as the events of the night came rushing back. Alexander finding the note. Sophie crying in the hallway. The drawing. Her stomach tightened instantly. She should leave before things became worse. Before she forgot why she came here in the first place. Emily quietly changed into fresh clothes and opened the bedroom door. The mansion felt unusually calm this early in the morning. No staff voices, no distant phone calls, just the soft piano echoing through the marble hallways like a memory that refused to fade. As she followed the sound downstairs, she stopped near the living room entrance. Alexander sat alone at the grand piano near the windows overlooking Central Park. He was still wearing yesterday's black sweater, sleeves rolled slightly to his forearms, exhaustion shadowing his face beneath the pale morning light. Emily had never seen him look this unguarded before. Billionaire magazines always described Alexander Hayes as ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. But sitting there alone at 6 in the morning, quietly playing music while snow covered Manhattan outside, he simply looked lonely. His fingers slowed across the keys before he spoke without turning around. Claire used to play this every Christmas morning. Emily froze. I did not mean to interrupt. You are not interrupting. His voice stayed calm, almost distant. The final note faded softly into silence. Sophie likes you. Emily looked down at the polished floor. She misses her mother. Alexander finally turned slightly toward her. So do I. The honesty in those 4 words caught her off guard. For months, she had imagined this man as cold, selfish, responsible for destroying her father's life. But grief had carved visible cracks into him. The giant penthouse, the expensive artwork, the perfect city skyline beyond the glass walls suddenly felt meaningless beside the emptiness sitting in his eyes. Emily carefully stepped closer. I lost my dad 3 years ago, she admitted softly. Sometimes grief makes a house feel haunted even when nobody is there. Alexander studied her quietly. Was your father close to you? Emily nodded once. He used to fix radios in our apartment every Sunday morning. Said silence made people overthink too much. A faint smile touched Alexander's face before disappearing almost instantly. Smart man. Emily's chest tightened unexpectedly. Because for one dangerous second, she forgot she was supposed to hate him. Then Alexander stood slowly from the piano bench and walked toward the kitchen. Sophie refuses breakfast unless you make the pancakes now, he said dryly. Emily blinked. You are joking. I wish I was. 20 minutes later, the kitchen smelled like butter, maple syrup, and slightly burned batter. Sophie sat on the counter wearing fuzzy socks and giggling while Emily tried unsuccessfully to flip a pancake that folded in half. Mommy burned them too, Sophie announced proudly. Emily laughed softly. Then apparently terrible pancakes are a family tradition. Alexander leaned silently against the marble island with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching them. Something unfamiliar settled over the kitchen. Warmth. Real warmth. Not the artificial perfection of charity galas or business dinners. This felt dangerously close to home. Sophie suddenly pointed toward a framed photograph near the window. That was Mommy's favorite song. Emily glanced toward the picture. Claire stood beside the same piano downstairs, smiling brightly while Alexander looked at her with a softness Emily had never seen before. Sophie's small smile faded slightly. Daddy stopped smiling after she went to heaven. The kitchen grew quiet. Alexander lowered his coffee cup slowly while Emily felt her heart ache for the child. Sophie looked between them carefully before asking the question neither adult expected. Do you think people get sent to us for a reason? Alexander frowned lightly. What do you mean? Sophie shrugged. Maybe Mommy sent Emily here because we were too sad by ourselves. Silence settled heavily across the room. Emily suddenly could not breathe properly. Because if Sophie only knew the truth, that Emily did not come here by fate or kindness. She came searching for answers buried inside Alexander Hayes' company. And upstairs in her drawer, hidden beneath folded sweaters, was a flash drive containing confidential files she had secretly copied from his office. That night, the mansion felt warmer than usual, and somehow that terrified Emily more than the freezing wind outside. She stood alone in the laundry room folding Sophie's tiny sweaters while the hidden flash drive burned like guilt inside her pocket. Every laugh from the kitchen upstairs made her chest tighter. This was not supposed to happen. She was supposed to collect evidence, expose the truth behind her father's downfall, and leave. Not care about bedtime stories and burned pancakes. Not notice the way Alexander quietly covered Sophie with a blanket when she fell asleep on the couch. Not memorize the tired softness in his eyes every time he thought nobody was looking. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Her father's voice echoed in her memory the same way it always did when she started doubting herself. Good people still exist, Emmy. Just because someone is powerful does not mean they are cruel. But the newspaper headlines had said otherwise. The investigation, the public humiliation, the firing. Her father went from respected engineer to broken man in less than a month. And Hayes Technologies had signed every document. A sudden voice behind her made her jump. Sophie said you hide in here when you are stressed. Emily turned quickly and found Alexander leaning against the doorway, sleeves rolled up again, tie gone, looking far more human than the billionaire she used to watch on television interviews. He held 2 mugs of hot chocolate in his hands. I did not know if you liked coffee this late. Emily stared at him in surprise. You made hot chocolate? Do not sound too shocked, he answered dryly. I can operate a microwave. Against her will, Emily smiled softly. Alexander walked closer and handed her one of the mugs. Their fingers brushed briefly, and for one dangerous second the room felt too small, too quiet, too real. Emily immediately looked away and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic cup. Thank you. Alexander glanced at the tiny sweaters folded beside her. Sophie has not slept through the night in almost a year. His voice lowered slightly. Until you came. Emily swallowed hard. She is just lonely. So am I. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Silence filled the room instantly. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the mansion. Alexander stared down into his cup before speaking again. After Claire died, everybody treated me like I was made of glass or steel. Nothing in between. Investors, friends, even family. He laughed quietly without humor. You are the first person who talks to me like a normal human being. Emily's chest tightened painfully because she knew she did not deserve that trust. Not while she was secretly searching through his private files at night. Alexander leaned back against the counter, studying her carefully. Why did you really apply to work here? Emily froze. Her fingers tightened around the mug instantly. I needed a job. In Manhattan? He asked gently. You commute nearly 90 minutes from Brooklyn every day in winter storms. Most people would quit after a week. Emily forced herself to stay calm. Some people do not have the luxury of quitting. Alexander's eyes softened slightly. He understood that answer better than she expected. Claire used to say survival changes people. Emily looked up slowly. Did it change you? He smiled faintly, but sadness lingered behind it. I think. It made me forget how to live. The honesty in his voice made her heart ache unexpectedly. Before Emily could answer, Sophie suddenly appeared at the doorway wrapped in her blanket, sleepy blonde curls falling over one eye. There you are, she mumbled. Then she noticed the mugs. You made hot chocolate without me? Alexander raised an eyebrow. You were supposed to be asleep. Sophie ignored him completely and climbed onto a nearby chair beside Emily. Mommy always said hot chocolate tastes better during snowstorms. Emily brushed her fingers gently through Sophie's hair. Your mommy sounded smart. Sophie nodded seriously. Daddy smiled more back then too. Alexander looked away toward the floor. The room fell quiet again until Sophie suddenly pointed toward the old silver music box sitting forgotten on the shelf above the dryer. It stopped working after Mommy died, she whispered sadly. Emily carefully reached up and took the music box down. Tiny scratches covered the faded silver surface, but when she gently opened it, a broken melody still played for 2 or 3 weak notes before stopping. Emily smiled softly. My dad used to fix things like this all the time. Alexander watched her closely. Can you repair it? Emily looked at the broken gears inside the box. Maybe. Sophie's eyes lit up instantly with hope. Really? Emily nodded carefully. I can try. Alexander stared at her silently while snow continued falling outside the tall windows. Because at that exact moment, watching Emily sit beside his daughter under warm kitchen light while holding Claire's broken music box in her hands, something unfamiliar began settling inside his guarded heart. Trust. And upstairs in Emily's drawer, hidden beneath folded clothes, the flash drive containing secrets about Hayes Technologies suddenly felt heavier than ever. 3 days later, Emily finally repaired the music box. She sat alone near the kitchen window long after midnight, tiny screwdriver in hand, while soft jazz played quietly from the old radio beside her. Snow had stopped falling over Manhattan, leaving the city glowing silver beneath the winter moonlight. The mansion was asleep except for the occasional crackle from the fireplace downstairs. Emily carefully adjusted the final gear inside the silver box and held her breath before winding it gently. A soft piano melody floated into the silence. Clear this time. Complete. Emily smiled without realizing it. I knew you could fix it. She startled slightly at the deep voice behind her. Alexander stood near the doorway wearing gray sweatpants and a dark sweater instead of his usual tailored suits. Somehow that made him look even more dangerous to her heart. Human. Real. Tired. Emily quickly closed the music box. I did not mean to wake anyone. Alexander stepped closer slowly. You did not. His eyes moved toward the tiny screwdriver beside her. You stayed up all night for that. Emily shrugged softly. Sophie loves it. Alexander leaned one hand against the marble counter and looked at her carefully under the warm kitchen lights. You do a lot for someone who claims this is just a job. Emily's pulse quickened immediately. Every conversation with him lately felt like walking across thin ice. One wrong word, and everything would collapse. Sophie deserves people who stay, she answered quietly. Alexander looked down for a moment before speaking again. Claire used to say the same thing. The mention of his wife no longer carried sharp pain in his voice now. Only sadness. Softer. Emily slowly reopened the music box and let the melody play again. The tune drifted gently through the kitchen while Alexander stared at it in silence. Claire bought that during our honeymoon in Vermont, he murmured. It stopped working the week she died. Emily glanced at him carefully. Sometimes broken things just need someone patient enough to repair them. Alexander's eyes lifted toward hers instantly. The air shifted between them. Quiet. Heavy. Too personal. Emily quickly looked away first. Upstairs, tiny footsteps suddenly raced across the hallway. Seconds later, Sophie burst into the kitchen in oversized pajamas. You fixed it, she gasped excitedly the second she heard the melody. Emily laughed softly as Sophie threw her arms around her waist. I told you I would try. Sophie grabbed the music box carefully and began spinning slowly across the kitchen floor while the melody played around her. For the first time since Emily entered this mansion, the room actually sounded alive. Sophie's laughter echoed against marble walls while Alexander stood nearby, watching quietly, like he was afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. Then Sophie suddenly stopped dancing and looked between them suspiciously. Why are you both looking at each other weird? Emily nearly choked on air. Alexander coughed into his coffee cup. We are not. Sophie narrowed her eyes exactly like her father. Mommy said people do that before they fall in love. Emily felt her face burn instantly, while Alexander looked genuinely unprepared for once in his life. Sophie, he warned softly. But the little girl simply grinned and hugged the music box tighter before running upstairs again. Silence crashed into the kitchen the second she disappeared. Emily focused very hard on wiping the counter, even though it was already clean. Alexander watched her for several long seconds before quietly asking, Are you happy here? Emily froze. The question should not have felt dangerous. But somehow it did. Because happiness had never been part of her plan. Revenge was simpler, cleaner, safer. She slowly set the towel down. I do not know anymore, she admitted honestly. Alexander nodded slightly like he understood more than she realized. Then his phone suddenly buzzed against the counter. The warmth instantly disappeared from his expression the second he read the screen. What is wrong? Emily asked softly. Alexander locked the phone immediately. Board meeting tomorrow. His voice hardened again, billionaire mask sliding back into place. My brother is coming into the city. Emily's stomach tightened unexpectedly. Your brother? Daniel Hayes, Alexander answered flatly. Chief Financial Officer. He has not visited the mansion since Claire's funeral. Something cold settled deep in Emily's chest. Because she recognized that name immediately. Daniel Hayes. The executive whose signature appeared on nearly every file connected to her father's scandal. Upstairs, Sophie's repaired music box continued playing faintly through the silent mansion while downstairs Emily realized the man truly responsible for destroying her family was finally walking straight toward her. Daniel Hayes arrived the next evening, just before the first snowfall began again over Manhattan. Emily saw him through the massive front windows as a black SUV stopped outside the mansion and a tall man stepped out adjusting expensive leather gloves like he owned the city itself. Even from across the marble foyer, she recognized him instantly from old company articles and courtroom photographs buried in her father's files. Same sharp jawline as Alexander. Same blue eyes. But colder. Calculating. The moment Daniel entered the house, the atmosphere changed completely. The warmth Sophie had slowly brought back into the mansion seemed to disappear beneath the weight of his presence. "Little brother," Daniel greeted smoothly while removing his coat. "Still pretending you sleep occasionally?" Alexander barely reacted as they shook hands. "You are late." "Traffic." Daniel's eyes moved lazily around the foyer before landing on Emily, standing near the staircase with folded towels in her arms. His expression sharpened slightly. "And who is this?" Emily felt her stomach tighten immediately. Alexander answered first. "Emily Carter. She works here." Daniel studied her for one uncomfortable second too long before smiling faintly. "Pretty maid." The words made Emily instantly uneasy. Alexander noticed it too. His expression darkened almost invisibly. "Sophie is upstairs waiting for dinner," he said coldly. "Try acting like family for at least 10 minutes. Daniel laughed softly. Still defensive. Claire used to complain about that. Silence slammed into the room. Emily watched Alexander's jaw tighten immediately at the mention of his wife. Daniel acted like he did not notice. Or worse, like he enjoyed it. Upstairs during dinner, Sophie sat beside Emily while quietly pushing carrots around her plate. Daniel spent most of the meal talking about investors, stock prices, and expansion plans while Alexander barely touched his food. Emily noticed the tension between them immediately. It was not simple sibling rivalry. It felt older, sharper, like years of resentment hidden beneath polished manners. Then Daniel suddenly turned toward Emily. "How long have you worked here?" Emily forced herself to stay calm. "Almost 3 months. "Interesting," Daniel said casually while sipping wine. "Most staff quit after a week. Alexander can be difficult when he is grieving." Sophie frowned instantly. "Daddy is not difficult." Daniel smirked slightly. "That is adorable." Emily saw the hurt flicker across Sophie's face and immediately reached beneath the table to squeeze her tiny hand reassuringly. Alexander noticed the gesture silently. "Emily stays because Sophie trusts her," he said flatly. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly, studying Emily again. "Trust can be dangerous." The comment hit harder than he realized. Emily lowered her eyes quickly before he could read something in her face. After dinner, Sophie begged Emily to help her build a blanket fort upstairs while Alexander and Daniel moved into the office for their meeting. The second the office doors closed, the atmosphere shifted completely. "You are losing control of the board," Daniel said coldly while tossing a folder onto the desk. "Investors are nervous." Alexander remained standing near the windows overlooking snowy Manhattan. "I am handling it." "By ignoring reality?" Daniel scoffed. "You disappeared for months after Claire died. The company almost collapsed." Alexander's voice hardened instantly. "Careful." Daniel walked closer slowly. "I carried Hayes Technologies while you locked yourself inside this mausoleum, pretending grief made you special." Alexander turned sharply toward him. "Do not talk about my family." "Your family?" Daniel laughed quietly without warmth. "The maid and the child?" Down the hallway, Emily froze outside the office door while carrying extra blankets for Sophie. She had not meant to overhear them, but the tension in Daniel's voice stopped her cold. "You think I do not notice what is happening?" Daniel continued. "You are getting emotionally attached again. That is exactly why people manipulate you." Emily's heartbeat quickened painfully. "She is an employee," Alexander answered sharply. "Then why did you investigate her father's case last night?" Silence. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Inside the office, Daniel's voice lowered dangerously. "Did you really think I would not notice someone accessing old company records?" Alexander said nothing. Emily slowly stepped backward away from the door, panic crashing through her chest. Daniel knew. Somehow he knew about her father. Her hands trembled around the folded blankets while fear settled heavily inside her stomach. Then Sophie's small voice suddenly echoed from upstairs. "Emily, are you coming?" Emily quickly forced herself to breathe again and walked toward the staircase before either brother could open the office door. But inside the study, Daniel stepped closer to Alexander and quietly delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You should ask your sweet little maid why she came into this house using a fake reference letter." Emily barely slept that night. Every creak inside the mansion made her pulse jump as Daniel's words replayed endlessly in her mind. Fake reference letter. He knew. Or at least he suspected enough to destroy everything she had built with Sophie and Alexander. By sunrise, Manhattan was buried beneath fresh snow while the Hayes mansion felt colder than ever. Emily stood near the kitchen window, clutching a cup of untouched coffee as anxiety twisted painfully inside her chest. She should leave now, before Alexander looked at her differently, before Sophie cried again, before her feelings ruined everything. Upstairs, footsteps echoed softly across the hallway. Alexander entered the kitchen alone, dark circles beneath his eyes, tie loosened like he had not slept either. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. The tension between them felt heavier than the storm outside. Finally, Alexander placed a folder on the marble counter. Emily immediately recognized the old newspaper clipping partially visible inside. Her father's case. Her breath caught instantly. "How long were you planning to hide this from me?" Alexander asked quietly. His voice was calm, but somehow that hurt more than anger. Emily slowly set down her cup. "I can explain." "Then explain." Silence stretched painfully between them. The city skyline glowed pale beyond the windows while snow drifted silently across Central Park below. Emily forced herself to breathe steadily. "My father worked for Hayes Technologies for 18 years, she began softly. "After the scandal, nobody would hire him. He lost our apartment. He got sick 6 months later." Alexander watched her carefully without interrupting. Emily's eyes burned. "He died believing your company destroyed his life." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "So you came here pretending to be a maid?" "At first, yes." The truth finally hung openly between them now, sharp and unavoidable. Emily looked down at her trembling hands. "I thought if I got close enough, I could find proof someone framed him." Alexander stared at her for several long seconds. Hurt slowly replaced confusion in his expression. "The office files. The fake recommendation letter. None of this was real." Emily looked up immediately. "No, that part was real." Her voice cracked softly. "Sophie was real. Every moment with her was real." Alexander turned away toward the windows, one hand pressed against his mouth as if trying to contain something heavier than anger. "Do you understand what you did?" he asked quietly. "I trusted you around my daughter." Emily felt tears rise instantly. "I never wanted to hurt her. But you lied to her every day." The sentence landed like a knife because it was true. Upstairs, faint music drifted softly from Sophie's repaired music box while silence swallowed the kitchen again. Emily reached into her pocket slowly and placed the flash drive onto the counter between them. "Everything I copied is there," she whispered. "I never gave it to anyone." Alexander looked at the flash drive without touching it. "Why not?" Emily's chest tightened painfully. "Because somewhere between bedtime stories and pancake mornings and quiet conversations beside midnight snowstorms, revenge stopped feeling simple. Because I started seeing who you really are," she admitted softly. "And it did not match the man I spent years hating." Alexander finally turned back toward her. The sadness in his eyes nearly broke her apart. "You should have told me the truth." Emily nodded. Through tears. "I know." At that exact moment, Sophie suddenly ran into the kitchen holding her rabbit plush. "Daddy, Emily promised we could build the giant blanket for tonight." She stopped instantly the second she saw Emily crying. Her small face fell in confusion. "What happened?" Nobody answered. Sophie slowly looked between them before her eyes landed on the packed duffel bag sitting beside the kitchen island. Fear immediately flooded her expression. "No," she whispered. Emily crouched quickly beside her. "Sweetheart, no." Sophie backed away, clutching the rabbit tighter. "You said you would stay?" Emily's heart shattered hearing the panic in her voice. "I am so sorry." Sophie looked desperately toward her father. "Daddy, tell her not to leave." Alexander closed his eyes briefly before answering in the quietest voice Emily had ever heard from him. "Sometimes people leave even when we do not want them to." Sophie's eyes instantly filled with tears. Like Mommy. The room went completely silent. Emily could barely breathe through the pain crushing her chest. Sophie suddenly ran upstairs crying before either adult could stop her. Emily wiped her face quickly and picked up her bag with shaking hands. Alexander still stood motionless beside the windows, grief and betrayal battling silently across his expression. Emily walked toward the front door slowly before stopping one final time. "For what it is worth," she whispered without turning around, "meeting your daughter changed me forever." Then she stepped out into the falling snow, leaving the warm mansion behind while upstairs Sophie's music box played alone in the dark. The mansion felt unbearably silent after Emily left. No laughter drifted from the kitchen anymore. No soft singing while pancakes burned on the stove. Even the warm lights inside the penthouse seemed colder now, like the building itself noticed her absence. 3 days passed, and Sophie barely spoke. She refused breakfast, stopped drawing pictures, and carried the repaired music box everywhere like it was the only thing keeping her together. Alexander watched his daughter quietly from the doorway one snowy evening as she sat alone beside the living room fireplace, hugging her rabbit plush. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Sophie kept staring into the fire. "Everybody leaves." The sentence hit harder than any boardroom argument ever had. Alexander slowly sat beside her on the rug. "Emily lied to us." Sophie looked up instantly, tears already waiting in her eyes. "But she loved us anyway." Alexander froze. Children had a painful way of simplifying truths adults complicated beyond repair. Sophie held the music box tightly against her chest. "When Mommy got sick, everybody acted weird around us. But Emily did not." Her small voice cracked softly. "She made the house feel happy again." Alexander looked away toward the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. Snow drifted endlessly through the dark sky, while guilt settled heavier inside him with every passing hour. Because despite the betrayal, part of him missed Emily too, more than he wanted to admit. Upstairs in his office later that night, Alexander finally opened the flash drive Emily returned before leaving. File after file filled the screen. Financial transfers, internal emails, confidential reports from nearly 10 years earlier. His expression slowly darkened the deeper he searched. Then one document stopped him cold. Authorization approved, D. Hayes. Alexander's pulse slowed dangerously. Attached beneath it was evidence proving data had been falsified during the investigation against Thomas Carter. Emily's father never leaked company information. He had been framed to protect someone higher inside the corporation. Someone with access to executive approval codes. Daniel. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair, disbelief and anger twisting together inside his chest. Every accusation Emily believed about Hayes Technologies suddenly made horrifying sense. The company really had destroyed her father's life, just not by his hand. The office door suddenly opened. Daniel entered casually without knocking. Still awake, Alexander turned the monitor slightly away. "You lied to me." Daniel barely reacted. "That narrows things down." Alexander stood slowly from his desk. Thomas Carter was innocent. For the first time all evening, Daniel's expression shifted. Not guilt, irritation. "You are digging through ancient history because of a maid? Answer me." Daniel sighed dramatically and loosened his tie. The company was vulnerable back then. Carter was asking questions he should not have asked. Alexander stared at him in disbelief. "So you sacrificed him?" "I protected the business." Daniel's voice hardened instantly. "Something you stopped doing after Claire died." Silence exploded between them. Alexander suddenly realized this was not simply greed. Daniel truly believed power justified everything. Lives, families, truth. None of it mattered beside control. "Emily came here because of you," Alexander said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "And now she is gone." Then he smirked slightly. "Which solves your problem?" Alexander's jaw tightened dangerously. "Get out." Daniel laughed softly. "You are emotional again. Exactly why you should not run this company alone. Get out." This time the words carried enough force that even Daniel stopped smiling. A few minutes later the mansion fell silent once more after the elevator doors closed behind him. Alexander remained alone in the office, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, while regret crashed through him all at once. Emily had told the truth. She came for answers, not revenge. And despite every reason to destroy him publicly, she protected Sophie instead. Protected all of them. Downstairs, faint piano notes suddenly drifted through the mansion. Sophie sat alone beside the tree, quietly playing Claire's old melody from the repaired music box. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Then his phone buzzed with a calendar reminder he had forgotten completely. Claire Hayes Foundation Winter Gala. Tomorrow night. The biggest charity event of the year. The event Claire loved most before she died. Alexander stared at the notification for several long seconds before a memory surfaced suddenly. Emily standing in the kitchen softly telling him broken things sometimes just needed someone patient enough to repair them. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat and car keys. Because for the first time in months, Alexander Hayes knew exactly where he needed to go. Emily almost did not answer the knock on her apartment door. It was nearly 11 at night. Freezing rain tapped softly against the Brooklyn windows, and she sat wrapped in an old sweater beside the tiny radiator while unpaid bills covered the kitchen table. The silence inside her apartment felt painfully different from the warmth she had left behind at the Hayes mansion. No little footsteps running through hallways. No piano music at sunrise. No Sophie asking if pancakes counted as dinner. Emily closed her eyes briefly, trying not to think about any of it. Then the knock came again. Slower this time. She stood carefully and opened the door halfway before freezing completely. Alexander Hayes stood in the hallway soaked from the rain, dark coat damp with snow, breathing slightly hard like he had rushed there without stopping. But what shattered Emily instantly was not him. It was Sophie standing beside him, clutching the repaired silver music box against her chest. The little girl looked up the second the door opened. "I told Daddy you would still be awake," she whispered hopefully. Emily felt tears burn her eyes immediately. "Sophie." Before she could finish, Sophie threw her arms around her waist. "I missed you." Emily held her tightly, eyes closing as emotion crashed through her chest all at once. Over Sophie's shoulder, Alexander watched them silently from the hallway. He looked exhausted, humbled, nothing like the untouchable billionaire she met months ago. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Can we come in?" 10 minutes later, the tiny apartment felt impossibly small with all three of them inside. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor beside the radiator, winding the music box over and over while soft piano notes filled the room. Alexander stood near the kitchen table, staring at the stack of overdue bills Emily had tried unsuccessfully to hide beneath a magazine. "You should not have come," Emily said softly. Alexander looked at her. "I was wrong." The words settled heavily into the room. Emily blinked in surprise. Billionaires in interviews apologize to shareholders. Not maids. Not women they accidentally broke. Alexander stepped closer slowly. "I read everything on the flash drive." His voice lowered. "Your father was innocent." Emily felt her breath catch painfully. Hearing the truth out loud somehow hurt more than years of suspicion. Alexander continued carefully. "Daniel framed him to protect the company during an internal investigation. I did not know." Emily looked away toward the rain-streaked window. "But your company still destroyed him." "I know." Silence filled the apartment while Sophie quietly played the music box nearby. Alexander's eyes never left Emily's face. "Tomorrow night at the gala, I am removing Daniel from Hayes Technologies publicly." Emily stared at him in shock. "Alexander, he stole years from your father. And I let it happen because I stopped paying attention to the people around me." His voice cracked slightly under the weight of the confession. "I cannot change what happened to your family, but I can stop pretending power matters more than truth." Emily felt tears rise again despite trying to stay calm. For months, she imagined this moment. Justice. Vindication. But somehow none of it mattered as much as the way Sophie smiled quietly beside them now, finally looking safe again. Alexander glanced toward his daughter before speaking more softly. "After Claire died, I thought grief was something you survived alone." He looked back at Emily. "Then you walked into our lives with burned pancakes and thrift store sweaters, and somehow made this broken little family feel alive again." Emily's chest tightened painfully. "I lied to you." "Yes," he answered honestly. "But you also loved Sophie when you had every reason not to love any of us." The apartment fell quiet except for the soft melody from the music box. Sophie suddenly looked up from the floor holding a folded piece of paper. "I made a new drawing," she announced proudly. Emily took it carefully. This time the picture showed 4 figures instead of 3. Sophie had drawn Claire as a star above them in the sky. Beneath it stood Alexander, Emily, Sophie, and a tiny crooked dog Sophie apparently decided they needed. At the bottom, she had written in uneven letters, "Family stays." Emily covered her mouth as tears finally slipped free. Alexander stepped closer slowly, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from his coat, chilled by the winter rain. "Come back with us," he whispered gently. Emily looked up into his tired blue eyes. "As what?" For the first time since Claire died, Alexander Hayes smiled fully, softly, honestly. "As home." Across the room, Sophie grinned and wound the music box again, while outside the snow finally began to stop over New York City.